I tried to stay objective about this watch, I really did, but wearing it for a few weeks now that completely failed. Because somehow this wild and crazy looking watch completely won me over. Now let me explain why, and this is the reason. The Fortis Stratoliner Re-Entry Edition. Wild, isn't it? But let's take a deeper look into this watch and let me explain why I love it so much, despite the fact that it has definitely got its own flaws. With bigger and thicker watches like the Fortis we have here today, everything comes down to balance. Balance in size, balance in weight, balance in design. You need enough visual detail to break up the thickness, otherwise a watch can quickly start to look slab-sided. Something you sometimes see on watches like certain two-door chronographs, for example. And that balance is exactly what won me over with this Stratoliner. Because honestly, this watch is kind of crazy, but in a good way. Hear me out, it's still very recognizable as a Fortis, but the case design is refreshingly different. The lugs are sharp and flow out of the case, and from the top you can see them bend aggressively inward to hold that Fortis 3-link block bracelet with those oversized screws on the side. It creates this very industrial, purposeful look, and because of that construction the bracelet falls straight down from the case, which actually makes the watch wear very balanced on my 6.7-inch wrists. I honestly didn't expect that with this watch, because if you look at the case profile from the side, the lugs are actually very flat. And normally that would make the watch feel top heavy and a bit wobbly on the wrist. So normally this wouldn't work. But somehow Fortis just make it work here. And I think that's because of the overall balance of the design. So the bracelet helps a lot here. It's quite wide at 21mm with no taper and combined with a solid clasp, which also offers on-the-fly micro adjustment. Everything stays nicely in place, but the drawback here is that it is not with a refined tapering that can make a watch look more elegant. What we see here is a bold, industrial and purposeful look. The lug-to-lug distance is not particularly compact either, which spreads the weight nicely across the wrist. But this also means that the watch can look large on smaller wrist sizes. And on my 6.7-inch wrist I can just pull this one off for what I would aesthetically like. Another thing that might help is that my wrists are relatively flat rather than round. So I recommend that if you are interested in this watch, that you would definitely trying it on first. Then you can see how it fits on your wrist. Because on paper the specs look big, but in real life this Fortis wears smaller than you might expect. And part of that comes down to the way the case is designed. But let's take a quick look at the specs before we continue. We have a 41mm case diameter, it's 14.5mm thick, it has roughly a 50.5mm lug-to-lug, its bracelet is 21mm wide and the watch offers a fantastic 200 meters of water resistance. Weight on the bracelet is about 180 grams, so it has a nice solid feel on the wrist. Inside we find the Fortis Work 17 column wheel chronograph movement with a decent 60 hours of power reserve. When you look at the side profile of the watch, it almost looks like a 1960s UFO shape, which I find quite cool. The overall case and lugs are very flat, like I mentioned, but what really breaks down the visual thickness are all the layers in the design that we can see here. At the bottom we have the case back secured with 4 screws. Then there's that distinctive black Fortis sealing ring, which connects the case back to the mid-case. The mid-case itself is actually quite thin and flows into the angular lugs, where those oversized bolts visually break up the mass of the steel. Then on top we have the bezel. which is also split into multiple layers and again features the black FKM sealing ring, which is typical Fortis. All of these elements visually reduce the thickness, so even though the watch is almost 50mm thick, it actually looks closer to a watch of 13.5mm thick. The finishing is fully brushed with a very fine grain, which suits the tool watch character perfectly. The pushers have a great design as well, and I really like the shape here. Also the crown features that black FKM ring underneath. Turning the watch over, we see a nicely executed smoked sapphire caseback revealing the industrial looking work 17 movement. The caseback is deeply engraved with the water resistance and the watch series, and we also see the words one of a kind, which refers to the dial because every Re-Entry Edition dial is completely unique. And that dial, yeah, that's something very special. It's made out of titanium and each one is literally burned by hand using an open flame. The result is a dial that looks almost like a spacecraft heat shield during atmospheric re-entry. Quite cool. No two are the same, and the deep color of that burnt spot on the dial is quite hypnotizing, with that colors that changes from bronze to the edges to a purple and deep blue hue of color. It really sucks you in visually like a black hole, and I noticed myself looking onto the dial without even knowing the time afterwards. Now, if I'm being completely honest here, as a drawback to the beautiful aesthetics, the readability isn't perfect, because the titanium surface can be quite reflective and the white printing also catches the light quite easy. So in certain lighting angles, legibility can drop quite a bit. I actually noticed something similar when I reviewed the Fortis F43 triple GMT titanium Flieger back in 2024. But visually these titanium dials are stunning. On the Stratoliner the texture is very fine and the grey titanium tone changes beautifully depending on the light. Around the edge we have a bright silver minute track with black and blue markers, and the absence of traditional hour markers keeps the dial looking very clean and technical. The central titanium plate sits slightly higher thanks to the sandwich dial construction, adding depth. Now here's something most people don't notice. Those blue markers on the dial aren't random design details. They actually represent the timeline of a Virgin Galactic suborbital space mission. Fortis designed the chronograph layout so you can follow the key phases of a commercial spaceflight. First, there's the rocket boost phase mated climb, which lasts roughly 60 to 90 minutes. On the dial that corresponds to the blue minute counter segment on the 6 o'clock chronograph minute scale. Then we have the microgravity phase, where passengers experience weightlessness for about 15 minutes. And that's why the first 15 minutes on the chronograph minute counter are marked in blue. Finally, the entire mission from carrier aircraft takeoff to landing takes about 1.5 hours, which is exactly why the first 1.5 hours on the chronograph hour counter are also highlighted in blue. So the chronograph is actually laid out to reflect the entire flight profile of a space mission. Pretty cool detail that gives this watch a very unique and special look. Now inside the watch we find the Fortis Werk 17 chronograph movement. And this is a big step for the brand, because for decades Fortis chronographs were powered by modified false U movements. Extremely reliable but not unique to Fortis. Now the Werk 17 was developed with legible to create something more purpose-built. It's a column wheel chronograph which generally gives smoother operation compared to cam actuated systems. The movement runs at 4 Hz, has a power reserve of 60 hours, day-date complication and a classic tri-compax chronograph layout. But the interesting part here is how it was tested. In 2021, Fortis partnered up with the Swedish Space Corporation and sent 13 of these movements into the stratosphere. They were attached to a helium balloon and launched from the S-Range Space Center, reaching an altitude of around 30 kilometers above Earth. During the test, the movements were exposed to temperatures down to minus 60 degrees Celsius, near vacuum pressure, high vibrations and extreme altitude conditions. And after the balloon bursts and returned to Earth with a rough landing, the movements were recovered and inspected, still running within performance tolerances. Which is exactly the kind of testing you'd expect from a watch designed around space-inspired engineering. And I have to say, the tactile feel of the chronograph pushers is really amazing. It's honestly one of the most satisfying chronograph actions I've experienced so far. To conclude the review, yes, I might be biased about this watch, but you know what? Sometimes that just happens. Every now and then a watch comes along that completely wins you over. It doesn't happen often, and I thought that I was out of the game after I bought my Omega Speedmaster during our holiday in Japan last year. But
just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
The price is 5,500 euros, which is a lot of money for something that I would only use to tie my eggs. Because all I know is that I don't have planned a space tourist flight anytime soon. But that is the thing with watches, is that value is always in the eye of the beholder. And for me personally, the Fortis Stratoliner Re-Entry Edition feels like a piece of industrial mechanical art, something I would generally enjoy wearing every day. Now let me know in the comments if this is a watch that you can get behind or not, and of course also the reason why. What would you like to see from Fortis in the future? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching.